I was just sitting in my office reading Hegel. I didn't realize it was 6 o'clock. I could have sat there for another couple of hours and just... I got lost. So before I forget, I have no idea how far we're going to get today. But if we get to the French Revolution, I realized last time I taught the French Revolution, I didn't have to teach it because Rebecca Como came here and spoke. Which is not happening this time, so she has a truly brilliant essay called, which is part of an even more brilliant book called Dead Right, Hegel and Terra. And it appears in the South Atlantic Quarterly. 103, which is spring, summer 2004. Pages 375 through 395. It's the best essay I've ever read on Hegel and the French Revolution. And I will pillage from it freely if we get there today. If not, I'll pillage from it next time we meet. She's a friend, and I'm allowed to do that. So last time we ended up talking about, my claim was that the discussion of state and civil society was operating an argument similar to Marx's on the Jewish question, in that the state represented universality, civil society represented the principle of individuality, and this just tracks down, right, from Antigone, right, where Creon represented universality and Antigone represented individuality, only now we're doing this in its modern form. Hence, the state represents general interest, while civil society, self-interest. The principle of civil society is wealth, while the principle of the state is state power. And that, to begin with, thinking about the late Middle Ages, and its kind of series of classes, I pray for you, I work for you, I fight for you, all these different relationships, to the absolute, that the noble is, and the code of nobility belongs to the state, and ignobility belongs to civil society. And that, of course, we can now recognize that these two moments of state and civil society, which we still have not got in any kind of right order, represent as the moments of the for itself, the moment of self-interest, the right of the individual on the one hand, and the grounding of that in some notion of universality on the other, that these two are reciprocally dependent in some way, but we have no way, and we're going to be following out this no way, we have no way of ordering this reciprocal dependency. Hegel thinks that he figured out a way in the philosophy of right, but here we're simply interested in the path that takes us from this original setup to the moment of the emergence of political modernity. So if modernity begins with Descartes, with the self-possession of the cogito ergo sum, political modernity will begin with the French Revolution, which is just as violent in its act of self-possession. So this is about the violent grounding of modernity. That's the movement we're going to be approaching, and approaching it through the Enlightenment, and how, as the argument's going to run forward, to see where we're going, that the classical argument is that German philosophy, beginning with Kant, running right through Schiller, the Romantics, into Hegel, German philosophy means itself to be the true inheritor of political modernity, of the French Revolution, and, as it were, carry on that revolution by peaceful means. Now, what that involves and whether or not German philosophy can do it is, of course, the question to be asked. Further, you should note, even before we get there, and again, just so we have this path of spirit in front of us, that this is one of the places where it will become clear that there is no neat chronology here. Because at one level, Kant's critical philosophy precedes the French Revolution, right? And then only becomes an interpretation of its continuance retrospectively. Right? That is, after the French Revolution, people looked back to Kant and said, now we can see what the foundations for it were and how better to continue it. And then, of course, as we have already seen, in The Spirit of Christianity and Its Faith, that Hegel conceives of Kant's philosophy, all just pointing forward, as itself a form of logical terrorism. And this idea that Kant's philosophy is indeed a form of logical terrorism is something that Heinrich Heine points out in his History of the Period. Heine says that Kant has in any case far surpassed Robespierre in intellectual terrorism, whereas the guillotine manages to kill off only a pathetic fat king who has lost his head anyway. The axe of reason has slain deism throughout Germany. And it's important, I'm suggesting that we're going to see a path here of this act of both individual and radical self-possession, and to say that's what we're heading towards. This is what the whole problem of faith and enlightenment is going to be, is to say that this whole path is setting loose not simply the principle of freedom. That's the Kantian line. It's the principle of negativity. So we're seeing the emergence or unleashing of negativity as a necessary aspect of freedom, namely its groundlessness, right? And what that means to our self-understanding as modern subjects. So this beginning point is really meant to set up this path that will take us, and Hegel thinks he can inherit all this without the pitfalls. And that will be, of course, the question for us, whether this history is inheritable. But I take it that that is our question. Right? And that is, as subjects of political modernity, we are not done with that question. Right? In fact, we say that the problem at the moment is we are so nervous about political modernity that we are disinheriting it at 100 miles an hour. Right? The revival of religion, the idea of communitarianism, all of these things are ways of trying to disavow the principles of political modernity. So that's the path for the next 3-4 weeks, 2-3 weeks, whatever. Or if I'm really slow, we may never get there. That's the idea. So let me just quickly then say how, just in a way, because I really do want to press this thought forward, just make the obvious point about state and civil society in its first appearance, namely in forms of honor and wealth, that of course this relationship is both unstable and necessarily reversible. And it's unstable and necessarily reversible because what makes nobility noble is that it is activity done selflessly. Right? That's what it is to do something for honor. Right? And it should not be done out of self-interest. So it's done selflessly as service to the state. So it is another version. Honor, we shall say, is a value-mediated version of the sacrifice of the individual to the state. And we saw when we talked about the Greek state that the state is simply, right, a machine, right, that sacrifices young men to its ends, right? Let's simply call it the Bush machine. And that we do not look at the death of those young men and all of that stuff, right? That same logic. So the early modern version of this is the theory of honor, but honor requires recognition, which is where Charles Taylor, for example, begins his account of recognition as in the early theories of honor. But if honor requires recognition, then receiving recognition is something that the individual achieves. And if it's something that the individual achieves, then it's something that they pursue. So that people pursue honor in order to be recognized. That is, if honor and recognition are non-detachable, then honor is not a pure, selfless, self-standing value, but a way or mode in which individuals are recognized, namely as honorable. But once that's the case, then it's something to be sought after for the sake of being recognized under that heading. That is, it has a necessary social content. And because it has a necessary social content, then honor is not, and here's the obvious reversal, honor is not in reality a selfless pursuit, but necessarily a self-interested pursuit, namely a goal that is pursued for reasons and to acquire something. Let's call it recognition. Further, in return for services to the state, the noble is rewarded. And surprise, surprise, what nobles tend to be rewarded with is wealth. So, nobles are rewarded with wealth, although they produce None. Right? Just like in our fine cousins in Washington, D.C. Halbert. Hence, and here you begin to hear exactly the note of Hobbesian skepticism, hence the general skepticism of the mercantile and early bourgeois classes about aristocratic ideals. That what is all this stuff about honor about? Well, it's about being recognized as honorable, and what does being recognized as honorable do? Well, it gives you wealth and power, right? I mean, in other words, the skepticism about aristocratic ideals in Hobbes is simply that these aristocratic ideals have all their social significance in their mode of circulation, and their mode of circulation is as modes of power, and that power is for the sake of Hobbes calls it felicity, right? Self-interest. Hence, in paragraph 497, he's just going to do the flippage up for you. It follows, Hegel says, then that the consciousness that is in and for itself does not find in the state power its simple essence and substance in general. It does, but not its individuality as such. So it's simply a simple restatement of the Greek problem. Right? The state provides universality, its essence, but not the moment of for itself, the moment of self-realization. And that's what he goes on to say, it does find there its intrinsic being, but not what it explicitly is for itself. Rather, it finds that the state power disowns action qua individual action and subdues it into obedience. The individual, therefore, faced with this power, reflects himself into himself, and it is for him an oppressor and the bad. That is, once you recognize that there's an opposition between the so-called universality of the state and your interest, and you find that your interests and those of the state diverge, then the state no longer represents your true essence, but what everyone complained about, even about Hobbes' version of it, namely the bad, namely as tyranny, namely that which opposes the self. So this is what I meant by these roles are getting continually reversed about what's good and what's bad. For instead of being of like nature to himself, its nature is essentially different from that of individuality. Wealth, on the other hand, is the good. It leads to the general enjoyment, is there to be made use of, and procures for everyone the consciousness of his particular self. This is the rallying cry of the early bourgeoisie. It is the rallying cry of the levelers. It is the rallying cry against the royalists. I mean, this is the English Revolution. This is the Long Parliament. This is that moment when the claim of bourgeois life as a self-moving form of life for which the state becomes merely the instrument, which itself is going to be a dire mistake, right? We call that dire mistake, right? Conservatism, Republican Party. But it comes at that moment, comes right out of this moment. Right? that moment where, so this is, if you want a modern version of this, you can just read Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Same structure of argument. Okay, well, paragraphs 506 and 7 then go on to chart the consolidation of the absolutist state in France. So one of the things that's dizzying about these passages is their flip-flopping from England to France and back and forth. One of the things that doesn't appear here is Germany. Germany never got the idea of the absolute state or the nation. It came in really late, which is why philosophy could be significant. Right? Germany actually began to seek its unification through its enlightened representations in philosophy and music and the like. So it's that high moment of late 18th century, early 19th century German culture that actually was generative of the German state. So all of this chit-chat at this point is tracking the development of modernity in England and France, and then it will center on France as the home of the Enlightenment, and then drift back to Germany. Why drift back to Germany? Just so we're flagged. Because Germany had something that France never had, namely Luther. So you've got to understand the development of modernity, why it's so difficult to track the complicated stories here, is in France you have the story of the development of the absolute state, which then turns into or flips into the modern state, right? But still carrying with it then the debate between state and church, but now the Catholic Church, while in Germany you're going to get the movement from Luther to German philosophy, and then only later a politics that's supposed to emerge out of German philosophy that's supposed to be able to avoid the difficulties of the French Revolution. Probably told you more than you wanted to know. But it's the difficulty of telling the story of the development of modernity, right? And it's the difficulty of Hegel's story because spirit, if we can put it this way, spirit jumps from country to country. Right? Spirit kind of appears in England and then jumps back to France and then stays in France for a while and then leaps over to Germany and Germany looks back to Greece and then... Okay. Just the way it is with spirit. So there is a consolidation of the absolute state in France with Louis XIV. Logically, the issue in this consolidation is what's being tracked here is the movement. As you move into the absolutist state, the question is, well, what happens to nobility and what happens to aristocratic ideals? Right? So we're leaving behind whatever happened in England. And we can ask the question this way, namely, if willingness to risk your life loses what it was to achieve qua recognition, then recognition requires a language of recognition. So Hegel is going to look at the reality of the new absolutist state that has centralized and consolidated itself into an individual. So it's as if the absolutist state has this thought that that's right. You can't have universality without individuality. Ergo, l'état c'est moi. that was the inference. I mean, that's how it got its bite. Why it's important to see that is different than the classical divine right theory of kings. Why that's an assertion of a certain kind of modernity, right? Because it's an assertion of the self as the representative of the state. Well, it's at this point that Hegel says that what's going to happen here is that everyone's going to have to find a way of pleasing this new king. And the question is, what do you do with a king that has absolute power? And the answer about what you do, if you're smart, is you flatter. You flatter and flatter and flatter. But that's to say that suddenly my relation, and let me point another way, well, what is flattery? What is flattery? Well, I think any of us who have ever either done it, or for those of us who haven't done it, I assume that what it's like to receive it, everyone knows that flattery is performative. That is, flattery is not a content, but a type of performance. That is, saying to someone, "Oh, you look gorgeous tonight," is not a descriptive, right? But, well, this is what this passage is going to be about. It's not a descriptive. You know, to say you are splendid, you are wonderful, you are the best king ever. The whole point here is the saying is the authority of that. There's nothing more than the performative saying. Which means at this very moment, the relationship between subject and king, if it's purely performative, becomes linguistic. So at this moment, Hegel introduces a moment in a philosophy of language and tries to think about the meaning of the relationship between self and language as we negotiate our way through the social world. And this is what is, he lays this out in paragraph 508. And paragraph 508 offers, for all intents and purposes, a slightly self-contained but unsurprisingly wholly performative conception of language. And it's fundamental to see this because I know, you've all been waiting for language to appear in Hegel. Well, here it is. And it appears in a kind of scary way. So, be careful what you wish for. But this alienation takes place solely in language. And we're still in culture, we're still in Bildung here. We're asking how it is culture operates, right, as a way of trying to connect moments of particular and universal, and how it is I form myself, right, into the kind of being who can receive recognition, right? So this is about this kind of language game as a particular kind of practice. But this alienation takes place solely in language, which here appears in its characteristic significance. In the world of ethical order, belong to man, yet in the actual world, counsel only, language as the essence for its content and is the form of that content. So the claim there is that under most significant relations, not the ones we're looking at here, the task of language is to be the bearer of a content, right? So if I offer you a bit of counsel, say, drink water twice a day, right? The important thing is not the speech act, but the conceptual content, namely the taking of the water. Right? In that sense, language is simply the bearer for Hegel of a content that is essentially what he thinks of as conceptual. But here, in this situation, it has for its content the form itself. So what is performative discourse? But using the form of language, that is, its expressive capabilities, it's, well, I'll say what you say, I'll let you say, its externality as a kind of content itself. But here it has for its content the form itself. The form which language itself is, and is authoritative as language. So the point about this moment is that this is, so the kind of performance I just gave, oh darling king, you look beautiful tonight, right? That idea of performativity is language appearing as language. Why? Because it is not instrumental for a content that is independent of it. Here, the form of language, its expressive power, and the content is the same moment. Right? There isn't a separable conceptual content, which is why I'm suggesting that hidden in this paragraph is something like a performative conception of language generally, because the claim is here, it's only under this kind of guise that language appears as language. So this is very, very close to Jakobson, right? Because Jakobson does the same thing, only he says it's poetry, not flattery, in which language appears as language and not as message. But it's the same argument because flattery is just the poetry of everyday life. It isn't my answer. Just checking your way. So the form which language itself is, it is authoritative as language. It is the power of speech as that which performs what has to be performed. That is, there is no other possibility here. If you want flattery, then flattery is a language. That's all it is. It can only be done as a language. For it is, and now comes the deepness. So far, I'm pointing to, let's call it, the inevitable hollowness of language. And I'm not going to back off from that. But as it turns out, the inevitable hollowness of language reverberates into the nature of subjectivity. For it is the real existence, the Dasein, of the pure self as self. This hollow language is the Dasein, the real existence of the pure self as self. Well, why? Because in speech, self-consciousness, qua independent, separate individuality, comes as such into existence so that it exists for others. Otherwise, the I, this pure I, is non-existent. So Hegel is claiming here that the only way in which a purely self-determining subjectivity can exist, and this is going to be fundamental for the rest of the argument, right? because he's here denying that introspection, internality, self-awareness, all that kind of stuff is self-existent. For Hegel, just like we saw earlier in terms of action, right? Action is the actuality. Well, let's say that the purest actuality of the pure self is speaking. That's the claim here. I come to be for the other, that have place in the world as a subject. I performatively saying myself. Otherwise, the I, this pure I, is non-existent, is not there, is not Dasein, right? Is not present. So, sometimes I look around the class and, what are you thinking, right? I don't know what you're doing. You're not there unless you say something, right? So that's what drives lecturers crazy. I don't know what's going on in there. And because I don't know what's going on in there, there's no there, right? So the I there, so the thought here is there can't be a there unless you speak back. Unless you speak, you come into worldly existence. Both for yourself, Hegel will argue, and for the other, right? It's going to work both ways.
But not just when you speak in this mode of flattery, so that someone speaks up and says, drink your water 5 times a day, that's just all the more unnerving. But it's only by responding to...
Absolutely, right. So the problem with why this is the self, and not the saying of something serious, right? Is if you're saying something serious,
exactly,
you've already eliminated yourself in the face of content. Content is subject free, right? So the content, if it's right, so in a deep way, it doesn't matter who says drink water 5 times a day. It's subject indifferent. But it matters terribly if I say, if it's I who say, darling, you look lovely tonight, right? And if my neighbor says it, then I'm worried, right? I mean, positionality matters totally because that's the way the self comes forward. So the self comes forward in the moment of the act of contentful emptiness. Right? Because content, we know, is universal and shareable. So only in the moment of emptiness does the self step forward. This is a terribly difficult moment in the formation of the modern subject, coming to this law. Yeah?
Why isn't it, as opposed to just being contentless performative activity by way of language, why isn't it just music?
It is. But that's the other side of it. I mean, that's what Diderot's Ram's nephew is going to say. That it's also just music. So this turns out to be, this is a moment, right? And it's not a self-sustaining moment. And it's not a self-sustaining moment because the other side of it is it's the radical externality of self to itself, and therefore so the same gesture. Isn't this the paradox of flattery? Think about what makes flattery so suspect. On the one hand, I've just convinced you, I hope, that it matters who says, darling, you're beautiful tonight, right? So it individuates, has to come from me, it's my relationship to the other. And yet, it's contentless. Right? It could be just music. That is, it is simultaneously a sheer externality. A sheer way in which I alienate myself from myself and make myself purely something in the world. So it doesn't matter. Right? This is the hollowness of the court. This is why the court was thought to be, by Rousseau, this is going to be the argument against theater. What you're calling music, Rousseau calls theater. And this is the beginning of the argument against theater. Right? Which we'll see, is what this chapter is also about. So what we're trying to get to here, this moment of language, is that moment in which, and this is only true with respect to a modern theory of subjectivity, that the modern subject must perform itself, and in that performing of itself, finds itself in a moment of radical inauthenticity. Because it's lost its relationship to its inside. Right? So this is...
Only an inauthentic creature can perform it.
Right.
Even worse.
Right. Which is a kind of, if you're a Heideggerian, you want to say this is why falling is structural. Why falling may be something you can always overcome, but it's always there. And it's there in the very mechanism of speech itself. Right? That's what falling is about. Falling is about the inherent degenerative feature of linguistic comportment. Right? Das Macht. Or is here the court. Same. In every other expression, it is immersed in reality, and it is in the shape from which it can withdraw itself. It is reflected back into itself from its action, as well as from its physiognomic expression, and dissociates itself from such an imperfect existence, in which there is always at once too much as too little, letting it remain lifeless behind. Language, however, contains it in its purity. It alone expresses the I itself. This real existence of the I is qua real existence an objectivity which has in it the true nature of the I. Think of this as it's unfolding as a version of the private language only not about a content, but about the I itself. That will be another way of reading this passage. The I must be in its linguistic expression, and what lies behind it is going to be idle, right? Because it's going to be emptiness if it's not taken up and held in place by that form of linguistic counting. The real existence of the I is our real existence, and objectivity, which has in it the true nature of the I. So the question is, how does I become objective? Certainly mumbling cogito ergo sum to yourself all day long won't do it. That's what Hegel's trying to get at. So the objectivity of the I is going to be the speaking of the I in those speech acts whose only meaning is to express the I in its relationship to another. To put itself. So what is this? Let's call this a moment of self-theatricalization. So what I am doing here in this act of flattery is literally simply performing myself. I am your sire. I am your liege. I am, right? What am I doing there? I'm just setting up what it is for me to be I, namely my relationship to you as here performed by these expressions that have no more content than their performative content. Because I am your liege just means I'm your liege. The I is this particular I, but equally the universal I. Its manifesting is also at once the externalization and vanishing of this particular I, and as a result, the I remains in its universality. What's being said here?
brain. So that didn't come from me. Anybody could have said it. Right.
No, it's not that. He's trying to think about how the I operates as a word here. And why. So this goes right back to sense certainty.
Well, I was just like, it reminded me of what happened in the you said when it was right past language and action, there was too much internal or too much external because it passes into the world and gets taken out. I guess that's not what I agree.
Well, but that's connected to it, too much and too little. The word I is how each and every individual appropriates all of language to him or herself. So that we all can say I, right, means that it's universal, that anyone can speak language. But the word I is that moment in language where I appropriate all of it to this particular perspective. So I is that moment, right, through which the universality of language becomes particularized by an individual speaking, and in that speaking takes hold of the whole of language. Right? And we can use it as a mechanism of recognition precisely because we can all say I. Right? So in saying I, each of us takes the whole possibilities of human expressibility from this point of view. That's the doubleness of I, and that was the argument, remember, in sense certainty. That in saying I, it meant to say just I, but it said the universal. Well, now Hegel's saying, no, the thing about the I is its capacity, right, depends on it being the universal. That's why it's called a shifter, right? A shifter because what I signifies is simply the speaker, right? But of course, who the speaker is just going to vary with who's speaking, right? So it has that capacity. So the I is this particular I, but equally the universal I. That's the so it's both of externalization. So the question was, why the emptiness? Well, the emptiness is because at the very moment I appropriate all to myself, indeed it is just me speaking, I'm also speaking the universal I, which is to say, let's call it the language of flattery. Right? So, as it were, there is a vanishing of this particular I. The I that utters itself is heard and perceived. That's a little Hegel phrase now. It is an infection in which it has immediately passed into unity with those for whom it is a real existence and is a universal self-consciousness. That it is perceived or heard means that its real existence dies away. So this is the moment at which how the original claim line is the I can only become objective by speaking of itself. Now the claim is, and that speaking of itself is the vanishing of the I. Because it will just be that language of you are so beautiful, and the I gets surpassed, so that there is something. So to say that the I is theatrical, which is what I'm saying, that the I performs itself, is to say that there is a mutual dependency between existence and emptiness, which is what is the problem of showing or appearing. the question of appearing, right, is that essence must appear. The I must appear, or it doesn't exist. But how do we stop it from being mere appearance? Well, the language of flattery is, as it were, the exemplar of that problem, because it is the case in which it is mere appearance. Right? Right? Which is why Hegel is bringing it up. It's that moment where language is doing all the work, and now we should be suspicious, independent of content. That's why we need content. Right? So the fact that this moment is necessary doesn't mean it's self-moving, doesn't mean it can collapse into music. Now is real existence, it is not real existence, and through this vanishing, it is a real, so just flopping. This vanishing is thus itself at once abiding. It is its own knowing of itself, and its knowing itself as a self that has passed over into another self that is perceived and universal. What Hegel's doing in these last sentences is trying to understand how a certain culture, we're calling it the culture of flattery, the culture of court life, actually operates as this movement between presencing and vanishing. That's the thought. So again, we might say at this moment, language appears as object, which is to say it appears as itself and not as instrument or bearer or rhetoric that is empty outside. It's not an empty outside of a significant content. It's not rhetoric. The formativity is language appearing as itself. So, inevitably, given what I've just said, Hegel is going to then analyze, for the remainder of the next several paragraphs, how silent service, or the heroism of silent service, is turned into the heroism of flattery. So all of this background about language is meant to try to understand the possibility of court life. And as court life becomes pure theater, the language of flattery is discovered, for the reasons we've already seen, to be empty. And because it's empty, the noble will detach himself from his performances, creating a certain inner self-distancing. Right? And this inner self-distancing is going to be part of the breakup of the absolutist state. Aristocracy, we may say, at this moment. So the point here is aristocracy and aristocratic ideas in France get channeled into the court. And the court then is perpetuated by the rituals of court or the theater of court. But these theaters don't even, although I want to be very clear, this theater is utterly modern. And in its discovery of a kind of, let's call it, a pure performative modernity, a pure performance of the self, that's what makes it modern. It also discovers that it cannot be an inheritor of aristocratic virtue. That in fact this version, this carrying on of aristocratic virtue into court life, is in fact a terrible emptiness, and hence, as we know what happens, namely everything moves from manner into wealth as what's important, and the display of wealth, and the bourgeois ideals and reality begin to more and more become to be realized here as propping up this hollow state. So you should be hearing, Rousseau's horror, right? And the rumblings that are going to lead to the French Revolution. There are more steps, but they're already implicit in this structure of, let's call it, corruption. Now, in order to produce a veneer of respectability and continuing the theme of Bildung, the aristocrats become patrons of the arts, and Hegel calls this moment of the production of the arts as a way of propping up an actual hollow political world, pure culture. It's the moment of pure culture. And it's the moment where culture appears as a veneer or a patina or an ideology that holds this form of life and consciousness together. And it's at this juncture where the court is trying to vindicate itself as producing, let's be clear, what's being produced here is what's called cultural enlightenment. Right? Enlightenment as music and the arts and theater and all this good stuff that happened. It's all of this as a mechanism of authority that Rameau's nephew attacks. So Rameau's nephew was introduced here as a critique of this last ideology of court life. Now, I'll say a few words and we'll have a break. The first thing you should note, people think of Hegel as only dealing with classics. This book was written in 1806. Diderot, for reasons that we can try to think about, did not publish Rameau's nephew during his lifetime. And it, in fact, appeared originally in German. And in a German translation by, of all people, Goethe. And it appeared in 1805. So here's Hegel trying to diagnose the meaning of modernity. And he doesn't reach for some grand classic. He reaches for this whacked out, excoriating, parodic satire on court life and modernity. Very hard to know exactly how to categorize this work. That had no canonical status. So I want to say that there's something radical about reaching out to Rameau's nephew here. That this is not Hegel as the classicist. This is Hegel as recognizing, as he might have recognized, I guess, in something like Tristram Shandy, a certain parodic self-consciousness at the heart of modernity here. Now, of course, what is going to be the tension in Rameau's nephew is between the nephew and the philosophe. And let's say that the philosophe, as philosophes tend to be, is dull, well-meaning, serious, and, alas, unworldly, while what the nephew reveals is a many-sided and disrupted consciousness. And what he reveals above all, and here's the problem, is the problem of the relationship between individual and role in modern life. That's what Rameau's nephew is about. That we are, and we like to think of ourselves as individuals, but yet to appear in the world, we have to, as it were, put on a mask, play a role. Say the role of a philosophy professor. Now, if I want to convince you of my seriousness as a philosophy professor, I was once at the APA, and I walked past the room, and there's a whole line of guys in black shirts and dark trousers, and they all had beards. And they're all scratching their beards. Oh, this must be a series. They're watching an NFL football. But they have perfectly got the mask of the philosopher. Now, what Rameau does is he is self-conscious about this mask playing. That is, he realizes that if roles, or rather, let's put it this way, he recognizes that roles are masks to be played with. And therefore, they are ways of manipulating your relationship to the world and therefore of achieving self-interest. That is, in order to achieve your interest, you don't appear as yourself. You appear in a certain role, namely the role of whatever your patron wants you to be. So if your patron thinks that painters, ought to look like Jackson Pollock, then you put on, old jeans and paint spattered in your throat, right? That's what a real artist looks like. Patron, oh, that's good, I'll buy that, right? Now, the question that Hegel then queries, and this is what Rameau's nephew is about, how do we put an end to the mask playing? Isn't the endless playing of roles as a mechanism of self-interest nihilism? That is, because how can I, if my only relationship to the world is through my masking of the world, then I can't even locate myself because I have then relegated myself to merely the person who is the endless mask player. And therefore, the only thing I have is my ironic distance from any of these roles as my means of authority. But that means of authority is fundamentally hollow. And it's fundamentally hollow because I can't locate it, because it has no externality, because it too becomes another role, namely the role of the wiseacre who keeps saying, yeah, but I'm just playing a role. And finally, the theatricality of the self overtakes the self and dissolves it. So the point is that at this moment, and this, by the way, is the same as, and that's why this passage of discussion around the is so important, is the same as Hegel's critique of romantic irony. That romantic irony is, again, the gap between the self and any position it might have held. Irony is that movement of self-distance. In this case, Hegel means to be taking up let's call it a universal problem. Namely, and I want to be clear, a universal problem in the nature of subjectivity. Namely, the moment of theatricality. That is, if the account of language was right, then the development of the French court for Hegel is a playing out of an ineliminable moment of subjectivity, namely, and let's be just the words, myself for others. That is, if I am to essentially, at some level, I must essentially have a being for others, otherwise I don't know what you're thinking, right? I got to get you out, right, from speaking. But that moment, if that's isolated, and that's what the claim here is, that the being of the self for others is what gets isolated in the French court, then the logic of that is what gets played out in the parodic self-movement of Rameau's nephew, so that, ironically, the effort of expressing myself, of making myself Dasein, exist for others, turns out to be a moment of abstraction for the self, leaving the self behind. So that there's a moment, this is what I was trying to talk about earlier, whereby I said that falling was structural to the constitution of Dasein. There's a moment of my being for others which I can never take back, right? I've got to have that moment or I'm no self at all. But that moment, if isolated, turns into its very opposite, namely instead of objectivity, it turns into the disappearance of the self. And that is simply there in the performativity of language on the one hand for Hegel, and in the working out of the language of flattery and court life on the other. That is, I think, the whole analysis aims at drawing out that movement. Okay, I'm overexcited, so so let's take a 5-minute break. Let me calm down, because I have to talk about serious things like faith and enlightenment, and we'll come back. So, just before we work the transition, Paul Cotman suggested at the break that we might well think about the opening scene of King Lear as the perfect exemplification of the problem of flattery. Paul, you want to say a little bit?
I mean, I was thinking that Cordelia's disgust with her sisters. I'm sure you all know the scene. He asks his daughters to tell him how much they love him, all their love in words. Her disgust has to do, I take it, with this emptying out, that only an inauthentic creature would be capable of this kind of flattery. That the very act of doing it shows you to be vacant, that vacated yourself. And so her problem in refusing to flatter and nevertheless still have something to say, can she still speak, is the problem of a more authentic subject. It's the problem that doesn't go away in courtly life, when it keeps re-emerging as the critique of courtly life from within it.
And of course, the depth of the scene, right, is it turns out that the question of flattery overlaps perfectly with the question of love. That is, how can there be an expression of love under conditions of courtly life that doesn't empty out into mere flattery? That's why Cordelia feels that her only recourse is silence. But silence, as Lear thunders, right? You say nothing, you get nothing. So one's life is lived at this structure, right? And that's what's exactly played out in the opening scene of Lear. It's corruptive power, right? And that's what's so wrenching about the scene. Its corrupting power is that it does not allow authentic speaking to occur. That once theater becomes, let's call it, the operative mechanisms of the social relation, then the notion of authenticity, that is saying, I actually love you, just the words of love, right, become impossible. Right? They become so much more hollow talk. And Cordelia just won't, it's as if she is hyper aware of the transformation from externality into emptiness is automatic, pushes her into silence that then becomes a sign of the very opposite of what she intends. That is, her silence as a way of trying to hold herself within her real wanting of love becomes a statement of rejection of the other, right? And hence she's the one who gets cast out. So this logic of flattery, this emptiness of court life, has another... It's interesting, because Spate, in his book, calls this comedy. Right? And that's how Hegel plays it, but I think we can see it's equally tragedy. Right? It's not obvious that this is a comedy at all.
It's not a comedy if there's really love.
Yeah.
I mean, it's only a comedy if there's nothing.
There's nothing there. As soon as there's really something at stake, then that structure has a tragic lining. Yeah?
That also means that in some sense, I mean, on Hegel, the futurists identities then lie with dominant and weak. That they represent the dynamic form. But in the same way that weirdly the future of consciousness turned out to be the slave not the master. Here again, it's kind of, it's not, I mean, the form of consciousness which is able to develop is not the kind of more synthetic inward form, but precisely that form of externality. But that would exchange why this.
But isn't that just another form of irony? Right? I think it's just the underlying. So the tipping point as to whether or not you take it as comedy or as tragedy is going to depend on the import of what's her name's line, I love you no more than duty allows, or whatever the exact quotation is. Right?
Which is why the flip side of Lear is Cinderella, right? So that there is something comic about the ugly sisters, right? And they are played comically. So that there is so it's the tension between the comedy of those who want only hollowness and the one individual who wants authenticity or love.
I mean, if you don't think Cordelia loves Lear and vice versa, it is a comedy.
Sure, no, I guess what I'm asking you, I can see from what Jason said why Cordelia's actions tell us something profoundly important about the nature of love. But it's not clear how in terms of play and in terms of and then therefore at least why flattery is shown to reveal something that then turns out to be important for the development.
Okay, good. No. It turns out that so the transition moment, let's see if this helps. You're absolutely right. The future of the transformative power, the movement of spirit, depends on the playing out of this emptiness to the very end. Why it's Rameau's nephew and not Shakespeare here. And that's because, but this is very close to Lear, because his way of analyzing it is that the continual language of flattery so empties the self out, it becomes a moment of madness, right? And that moment of madness throws the self back onto itself without any masking at all. That's how he works the transition. So paragraph 526. That's beautiful. Thank you. That's great. He runs through the whole structure of the analysis, and then top of page 321, he says, it is the self-disruptive nature of all relationships and conscious disruption of them, but only as self-consciousness in revolt is it aware of its own disrupted state, and in thus knowing it has immediately risen above it. So it's not in the moment of love, it's in the moment of what's called disgust that the transition happens. right? There is no room for content here, right? There is no room for content. That's why Lear is a tragedy. That's why, and if I'm right about tragedy, tragedy necessarily is non-transformative. That's what it's about. It's about limit situations that cannot be further sublated. Right? Tragedy is that blockage of sublation. Which is why, we want to get to this, why there's a whole argument about whether this book is a comedy or a tragedy. Right? But only as self-consciousness in revolt is it aware of its own disrupted state, and thus knowing it has immediately risen above it. In that vanity, all content is turned into something negative, which can no longer be grasped as having a positive significance. So this is the emergence of the moment of negativity itself for its own sake. Right? It's that moment where if my manipulating of the masks is self-defeating, then all I am left with is my distance from any mask, which is myself as sheer negativity. That's the thought. So the positive object is merely pure I itself, called the transcendental unity of apperception, the cogito, pure negativity. And the disrupted consciousness in itself, this pure self-identity of self-consciousness that has returned to itself. So to speak, early modernity, having discovered subjectivity, as it were, played it out, but played it out as an empty form. That's the argument. And if it's just an empty form, right, then we have a problem. So the response to that problem is to say that the self now has relocated itself as this power of negativity and now has to find content. And that content appears in two signature ways: faith and enlightenment. That those are the return out of the emptiness of modern subjectivity in the search for an absolute content. So, the way Hegel runs the argument is to say that skepticism about culture, which now means about pure culture, which means about Bildung, about self-alienation, all of that which we've been now reading, right? So the whole episode now of culture and Bildung, right, turned out to be about the self-formation of a self-making self, right? But it turned out that there was no content to that. And we now are left with that moment of negativity and how we're going to find content again. Which is, again, the question is how secular modernity can have content if the principle of secular modernity is subjectivity, is the pure I, is I think. And Hegel says that in response to the hollowness and vanity of early modern culture, what was the response to it was, on the one hand, a new type of religiosity as an expression for the desire for spiritual substance. So what he's thinking at is the forms of Protestantism. So pietism, Jansenism in France, that's the form, and Jansenism is a really interesting moment. Right, because that's Pascal. Quietism, Wesleyanism, what all of these share is a new emotional relationship to essence, and hence an attempt to have a immediate relationship between subjectivity we're calling now faith, in this now significant, new, and weighty sense that Luther and then Pascal are inventing. I want to be clear now, we're inventing this notion of faith because this is the immediate relation of the self via this posture to its object, and corresponding to it, and this is the trick of Hegel's whole argument here, and corresponding to it a passionate naturalism that we call enlightenment, with its emphasis on unbiased thought and observation. So the trick now, or the rest of the argument here, running right through the French Revolution, for reasons that I'm now going to try to spin out, are to say that, and this is crucial for Hegel, as it is, by the way, for Adorno, who stole the idea for his entire book from this chapter, that faith and pure insight, faith and enlightenment, are a couple. They are wedded together. They cannot be separated. They need and depend on one another. And now I'll try to show you a bit why that must be the case, and why that folie à deux has the logical structure that will take us, I think, almost seamlessly, once we understand their relationship, to the French Revolution. That's certainly Hegel's attempt here, to make the French Revolution the political realization and working out of the impossible relationship between faith and enlightenment. Well, faith and enlightenment share two assumptions. And we can say that the two assumptions are themselves simply the different moments of the transcendental unity of apperception. So the two moments are the following. First, that to know X, or to believe in X, or to be related to any substance, is to submit it to authoritative grounds that are not dependent on any transcendent source for their authentication. Say that again. It's just what we mean by you have to think for yourself. But I'm saying it in the most complicated way I know how. That is, that for you to have a belief at all, it must match grounds that are fully acceptable to you as believing subject. So this is the idea that there can be no given authority. This is the critique of all givenness, right? That anything for us to count for us as authoritative must be conformable to the mechanisms of subjectivity. So it must be an internal relationship that puts us in relationship to any externality. Right? So in Descartes, just to use Descartes as the simple way, it's certainty. Right? So when he does the reguli, he says that let's look at a long logical procedure. What does he say? He must be certain of, immediately aware and certain of the premise. And then you must, in seeing the relationship between the premise and the next step, treat that as itself an immediate certainty. So the whole thing tries to be an idea of, the whole train must have the awareness of an immediate self-certainty of the whole path. Right? So that as if I am aware of what's external by it having the weight for me of immediate self-certainty. But that also is what we mean by faith. that my belief in God, my inner resolve that He is my Lord and Savior and I am saved, does not come from Him. Right? Faith is that I give Him that authority. Right? That my self-possession works through a self-dispossession. Right? So it's that double movement. The second side of that modern belief, which is again just the critique of external authority. That's all I'm suggesting. It's simply what we mean by we have no reason to believe anything for which we do not have reasons that are okay for me. Right? That we take nothing on, I would say nothing on faith, but we take nothing on another person say so, and therefore I have to fully believe it, where believing can now be either cognitive or affective religious. Right? Same thought. Secondly, that to know X is to be in possession of grounds for belief that hold for all individuals, that is, that are universal. So the trick of modernity is to want a moment of radical subjectivity in the authoritative grounds for belief that is simultaneously universal. Which, again, I've said before, is the trick of Descartes and Kant, namely to find in the inner structure of subjectivity a moment of universality that holds for everyone. That's what the transcendentality of apperception means, and that's what the moral law means. Now, as forms of spirit, as ways of people comporting themselves as a people to the world, faith and pure insight both give on to the whole of spirit, but, this is Hegel's argument, in divided form. And his rough and ready thesis here is that the moment of faith is a moment of a sheer, immediate awareness of content, of pure, unmediated awareness of substance. Or, if you want to do romantic poetry, what Jeffrey Hartman calls the unmediated vision. So this will run right through, this moment will run right through early Romanticism. This is his analysis of Wordsworth right through, in fact, that book ends with Rilke. So faith is immediate awareness of content as essence beyond intellection. That's the crux of it. It's beyond intellection, which is why it's an emotive or emotional relationship to the absolute. Conversely, pure insight is a refusal of all content and is a skeptical interrogation of content that hopes to achieve the truth through a negative and skeptical process. That is, by doubting everything until we can make it certain. Now, put in this way, we might say that pure insight is concepts without intuitions, and faith is intuitions without concepts. So the relationship between enlightenment and religion here is being set up like a Kantian structure. That religion is the bearer, and it's important that religion is the bearer of the abused, lost content of modernity, and that insight is the skeptical self-consciousness of modernity looking for authoritative conviction. So, paragraph 5 529, I guess. Yeah. Okay. Or let me just start on the bottom page 323, and then it goes over. Spirit. I always read these passages again, just so you know I'm not making all this up. Spirit, in accordance with its truth, is an undivided unity at once absolute movement and negativity of the process of manifestation, as well as, so that's going to be the moment of pure insight, as well as its inwardly satisfied essence and its positive repose. So, negativity on the one side, repose and satisfaction on the other. But coming generally under the determinateness of alienation, these two moments fall apart into a dual consciousness. So that description for Hegel is how he's going to describe the spirit at the very end. It's both always self-moving and in repose, right? That famous passage from the preface. But at this moment, those moments are still divided. So he says, but coming generally under the determinants of alienation, these two moments fall apart into a dual consciousness. The former is pure insight as the spiritual process which focuses itself in self-consciousness, a process which is confronted by consciousness of what is positive, the form of objectivity or of picture thinking, and which turns against it. But pure insights, so this is Kant, think for yourself, never believe anything until you have proof of it. This is the thought that the fundamental gesture of enlightenment is critique. And above all, we're going to say the critique of religion. That enlightenment is the attempt to vindicate secularity through the critique of religion. The simple consciousness of the positive, or tranquil self-identity, on the other hand, has for its object the inner essence qua essence. And then he runs what I'm calling the Kantian synthesis, or the broken synthesis. Pure insight has therefore, in the first instance, no content of its own, because it is negative being for self. To faith, on the other hand, there belongs content, but without insight. So, insight without content is empty, insight without. Faith without concept is blind. So the thought here is that enlightenment has no content of its own, and therefore what it is a drive to intellection and rationality. And we might say it's a metaphysical desire for universality. And as such, it challenges every content to meet its standards of rationality. That is, show me that you are absolutely and purely compatible with the demands for pure rationality, or you are nothing. And you will begin to hear what is called the logic of suspicion, which is going to be the logic of the French Revolution itself and lead to the Terror. So I want you to hear already in Enlightenment skepticism, and Enlightenment as skepticism, and in Jim Schmidt's wonderful Reader on Enlightenment, if you read all those documents of German and French Enlightenment, the one thing that is steady throughout all of it is skepticism of anthropomorphism. Right? That the problem Enlightenment faces is it looks as if we have populated the world with projections of ourselves. Some of them we call God, some of them we call nature, but they're all just personifications or projections of the human. And we have to see through them. So what we want is self-evidence and certainty. at paragraph, what do I want to say here? We're running out of time. So what I'm going to suggest is, and we'll pick up here next week, that what gives enlightenment its authority and its power and its content is its skeptical procedure. That is, it shows itself to be having dinner with an analytic philosopher, and he says, that guy has his chops. So how the way in which enlightenment shows it has its chops is by showing that other people's beliefs are false or hollow or empty, right? And what we call this is being a first-year philosophy student, right? Nothing more. What I'm trying to get you to see is why this is a powerful moment. Why skepticism can feel like itself a deep form of authority. What I mean by skepticism is not doubting everything, but a skeptical procedure of doubting, where you grow in your convictions of the depth of your subjectivity by the power of your methods of doubt. That is, there's something tremendously authorizing about this. I mean, it's part of what attracted all of us to philosophy, to discover that we could doubt things that our parents told us was true, right? Every philosopher is still rebelling against the law of the father. And maybe searching for mother's love. Bad way to get it. And this is going to be, this process is going to be shown that it depends on its object. That's the thought here. That if this mechanism is you get your authority through doubt, then you need something to doubt. You get sometimes, in the land of this thought, enlightenment is said to be a light, right? Illumination. What is light? Without an object to shine on. Sheer emptiness. So what Hegel wants to do is take the moment of negativity, right, and show how it's bound to the object that it is doubting. And that without that object, it would be empty. Which means, and this is the difficult moment that we're going to have to think about over and over again, that religion is a kind of misunderstood object. That religion is the bearer of an absent content that we haven't figured out. And I don't mean God. I mean it's the placeholder for content. And we have to figure out what that content is. Okay.